Hello, history students. It's good to talk to you. I'm trying to do something a little bit different. Here's my wonderful face. Not that you need to see it, um, but a little bit more personal interaction as we go through a lesson on the 60s. This video is going to be watched by my regular class as well as my AP class because of changes that they've made to the AP test and curriculum and all the rest. So anyway, we are talking about the 60s today, and you're not going to have to look at me the whole time, but I will be going through a PowerPoint. But before we get started on that, I want to start off with a little bit of a song from the 60s and really about this time. And you guys may know the song, Bob Dylan's song, The Times They Are A-Changin'. And it's really all about the revolution that was the 60s, this great decade of change. By great, I just mean massive. There are good changes and there are bad changes in the 60s, but regardless, it is extremely important. The song kind of gets to some of those things and how society is changing so much, how this youth culture is emerging. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present my screen, and I'm going to begin with just a little bit of this song, The Times They Are A-Changin', and just the lyrics are there for you guys. I kind of started in the middle just so you guys can kind of listen to the stanza.
Mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are a-changing. The line it is drawn and the curse it is cast. The slowest one now will later be fast, and the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will later be last, for the times they are a-changing.
Okay, I don't want to belabor that too much. I don't know how good your audio is. It might be awful, but we don't need that in there. Oh, I'm opening the wrong PowerPoint. Let me close this. There we go. The lines in there in that song about the times changing and the idea of your old road is rapidly fading, kind of the old way of doing things, life in the 50s, life before then, that whole life is moving away. And there's this whole new way of living and this whole new view of life and society that we see emerging in the 1960s. Okay, so some of the things that we talk about in the 1960s, a lot of textbooks refer to it as sort of the turbulent 1960s. And it was a turbulent time. We're going to learn about several key assassinations. Kennedy's assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, who was running for president and may very well have been able to win, he was assassinated. Malcolm X is assassinated. The guy who killed Kennedy is assassinated. So there's a lot of things going on in here. One of those is it is a time where some really high profile people are killed in public life. And so it is a time where turbulent would be a good word for it. The times they are changing. Obviously we looked at that song a little bit. The 1960s was perhaps the decade that changed America the most. And maybe that's an overstatement. Of course, like the 1770s, we did declare independence. So maybe that would be the most. But as far as society, I don't know of anything that was a bigger kind of revolution in society than the 1960s. A few things to point out, hippie movement and counterculture, that has sometimes been kind of wrapped up in the phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll. These were, of course, big parts of this whole hippie movement. And wrapped up in the hippie movement as well, a lot of times, was protests of the war, also protest against segregation. A lot of times those things went together, but there's some overlap, but they're not entirely the same thing. Kind of overlapping this too, what we call the sexual revolution. I have the term the birth control pill. The birth control pill really comes out in this time, and maybe one of the biggest changes in the 60s was, and this is an overstatement, let me just say it this way. Plenty of people before the 1960s had sex outside of marriage. It's not like that was unheard of. That has always been done. But at the same time, there was this cultural consensus, and really not just in our culture, but in cultures all around the world, that marriage and sex were something that went together. And it was a deviation from an ideal to go outside of that. And so a lot of times, if you were known to have sex with someone, then it was your family put pressure on you, you have to get married. That was sort of the norm in human society, and had been. And a big reason for that was that sex produces kids, and the birth control pill changes that. And so the idea of needing a family, and sex and marriage belonging together, and sex producing children, and so of course you need marriage, and you need a family to raise children, and all the rest. These things are in decline, and there is historians and scholars call this a sexual revolution. And of course, the hippie movement, the counterculture people embrace that. And threw out rules when it came to sexuality. And this, it really begins a huge shift in culture, to where now, at least if you watch TV, it's expected, if someone is in a serious relationship, then they're living with their the person that they're serious with. That's like the norm, at least according to TV. And it's a norm for a lot of people in society. That is entirely not the norm, and before the 1960s, and even during the 1960s. But the change begins there. We need to move on. We're going to talk about these things more. Particularly, we're going to talk about the civil rights movement more. But the 60s ended legal segregation. So there's some changes that are really positive in the 1960s. The 60s saw the Vietnam War, and with all its good and bad. A long war. The dates that I have for that, 1964 to 1973, these dates only describe where the major U.S. involvement, as far as troops being sent to Vietnam in active combat, but we were involved in Vietnam even in the 1950s. You have people protesting the Vietnam War. Because of its length, particularly, it becomes a very unpopular war, and we'll get into that later, but we have a lot of big things going on in the 1960s. And I think the regular U.S. history textbook spends probably too much time on the 60s. There's like 4 chapters. We'll try to do those a little bit quicker. We're not going to spend like the rest of the school year on the 1960s, but we'll certainly spend some time on it, particularly civil rights. Okay. Let's begin with politics. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do in this lesson, I kind of gave you some overview stuff, but this lesson is really going to deal with the politics of the 1960s, particularly. The election of 1960 is Kennedy and Nixon run against each other. Nixon had been Eisenhower's vice president. You guys remember Eisenhower, Republican President Eisenhower. Nixon was his vice president. Nixon was very savvy politically. He was knowledgeable and experienced. Kennedy was a little bit green, as in young. But most historians kind of look back at their debates being televised, and just the fact that Kennedy was this young, more handsome personality that, maybe he didn't know the issues as well as Nixon, but he had this energy and this likability that really came across on camera, even black and white camera. or black and white TV. He had this energy that really came across, and Kennedy really inspires people. And he wins the election against Nixon, which was a surprise. There's a lot to know about Kennedy that I don't have time to get into. His whole background and his father and his family and this family that was in politics, and his father being an ambassador, and uh, there's just a ton. The Kennedys are a complicated and confusing family in a lot of ways, and a tragic family in a lot of ways. But we don't have time to get into it. One thing that I do want you to note, though, is that Kennedy does, and we'll talk about the civil rights movement later, but these are all going on at the same time. There's really no way to separate it, even though we're trying. But the civil rights movement was definitely on by the 1960s, and Martin Luther King Jr. was a national figure, and Kennedy is able to convince MLK that he will support civil rights. And for a Democrat to support civil rights, remember the South had been heavily Democrat, was still a controversial issue. And so Kennedy does support, MLK supports Kennedy. And really, probably more than any other time in history, you start seeing a significant number of African-American voters voting Democrat because of Kennedy's promised support of the civil rights movement. And Kennedy, once he gets elected, he's very slow to move on this, but he does, kind of gain the support of MLK, and you start seeing this massive shift, and of African American voters voting Democrat, which is still a reality today. It goes back to this. Kennedy's called what he called kind of his vision for the country was the new frontier. He wanted to take on poverty. He's a Democrat, and influenced by people like FDR. He wanted to take on poverty. He also wanted to cut taxes, which he did do, which was good. He wanted to expand, legislate civil rights and segregation laws, and to do away with those. He also wanted America's presence around the world to be positive. And the Peace Corps is all about, using America as this role for good around the world, right? We have a whole new role around the world after World War II. And in the 1950s, trying to figure out what that is, containing communism. Well, Kennedy's idea behind that is to send out people in the Peace Corps to volunteer and to build wells. And, I knew a guy that lived in Indonesia in the Peace Corps in the 1960s. I mean, he heard Kennedy say, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. He heard that, and he signed up to the Peace Corps. And he actually trained the Indonesian Olympic track team because he was an athlete. I met him when he was old, but he came back and visited Indonesia. He was a fascinating dude. Kennedy also begins the Apollo project, which Kennedy pretty quickly, begins to declare that we are going to send a man to the moon. And he had this optimism that we can do it. We're gonna send a man to the moon. We're gonna tackle poverty. We're gonna make this a better society. And a lot of people were just really positively influenced by Kennedy. And he is a kind of liberal Democrat, but at the same time, like I said, he did cut taxes and usually have a balanced budget. So it was, he's fairly well liked on both sides once he becomes president. Kennedy does have some problems in Cuba. We don't really have time to get into the Cuban Revolution, but just very simplified. Cuba had a terrible dictator named Batista. And there's a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro. Batista, because he's not communist, he's generally supported by the United States. And Castro, who, when he's leading his revolution, really doesn't put all those cards on the table. People didn't really know he was a communist, but he does lead this overthrow of the Cuban government, and it was a corrupt, terrible. Batista was not a good dude, but Castro takes over, and then Castro imposes a communist regime in Cuba, and it is a brutal regime. Castro gets way too much credit. People have fled Cuba for the last, since 1959, because it's taken away people's property and people's livelihood, and there's basically universal lack of equality in Cuba unless you are a government. Castro died as like one of the richest people in the world, but Cuba was one of the poorest countries. In 1961, Kennedy's administration devises this plot to have the CIA train Cuban refugees, because we have a bunch of Cuban refugees, to train them and to send a force back into Cuba, into an area of Cuba known as the Bay of Pigs, to come in and begin sort of this counter-revolution against Castro. And it's a total failure. And the Bay of Pigs invasion, it's found out, and these the people being sent in are killed, and it's just a total flop, and it doesn't look good for Kennedy. So it was a huge failure on Kennedy's part. And then in 1962, our spy ships over Cuba, or planes over Cuba, notice some missiles, and these missiles are confirmed to be atomic, and they are pointed at the United States. And I don't know what page. I'm not looking at the textbook right now, but there's a page in the textbook that shows their range. And yes, we could have been basically wiped out by missiles from Cuba. But they were put there by the Soviet Union because Cuba is now communist and is allied with the Soviet Union, and this is the Cold War. And they're put there, and the idea is to be able to have this proximity to the United States if the Soviet Union does have conflict with the United States. And this really is the height of the Cold War. For 14, I think it's 14 days or 13 days in 1962. People are on the edge of their seat. Are we going to get blown off the face of the earth is really the question. And it's a question that sort of haunts all of the United States, probably Soviet Union as well, during the Cold War, so from the 1945 to 1989 is kind of the question on the back of people's mind. But in 62, with the missiles in Cuba, it is on the front of people's mind that there's going to be this nuclear holocaust. Fortunately, there's some negotiation. Castro does remove the missiles. We removed some of our missiles that were pointed at the Soviet Union and Turkey, kind of do all that covertly, and things settle down. And the Cold War kind of goes more back to normal. But the reality is that Cuba, our neighbor, and you think about the containment, the policy of communism, Cuba, our closest neighbor, at least other than Mexico and Canada, is a communist nation supported by the Soviet Union that puts missiles, nukes aimed at the United States. So, like, the idea of containing communism, there's a reason for it. And this is a clear example of why we sought and we pursued that. Because the communists did see themselves as the enemies of the United States and vice versa. Berlin Wall is built in 1961. I don't think we're going to get into that. Kennedy administration does install a hotline to Moscow to where we are in constant conversation with the Kremlin, with the leaders of the Soviet Union, and kind of continue to be throughout the Cold War. But I kind of want to focus at least a little bit on this. The Kennedy assassination. I have a documentary, but it's on DVD, and I can't show it to you. But if you ever get a chance, it's actually, let's see, produced by Tom Hanks. It's part of the thing called The 60s that I think aired on CNN. But the Kennedy assassination one is really good. If you get a chance to watch it, I couldn't find it to send it to show it to you, but Kennedy is assassinated in his first term. So Kennedy has all this promise, and he has all this energy, and he has all these things that he's going to do and things that he's going to change. But in reality, there's very little that Kennedy did that he wanted to do as president. Let's put a man on the moon. Well, he might have got the wheels in motion to do that, but it's not like his administration did it. And it's not his fault. He was killed 2 years into his presidency, or 3 years, 2 to 3 years. I put the end of Camelot. Camelot is what they called his White House, his family. It was just idyllic, and everyone loved his wife and how pretty she was, and they had young kids, and he was the youngest president ever. And there's all this optimism that really surrounded Kennedy. And so his assassination, which is odd in itself, but his assassination is not just he's the president's assassinated, and then we just go on to life as normal. It really does kind of mark the end of this kind of optimistic post-World War II approach that America's got this, rah, rah, rah. And you start seeing just a lot more tension, a lot more problems, a lot more disillusion in society. It's just the end of a lot of people's optimism. I know this is kind of ridiculous, but I just was thinking of a Guns N' Roses song, and I think the song is called Civil War. But one of the lines is in my first memories they shot Kennedy, and it's just like the image of someone who's a young kid and probably idealistic and looks at the world in rose-colored glasses, and then Kennedy is killed, and it really does kind of shape negatively people's view of the world. To get into at least some of the details, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of conspiracy theory around the Kennedy assassination. What we can say with a great deal of certainty is that Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy. He was at the scene with a gun. His prints were on the gun. He ran. When he ran away, he shot at an officer. There really would have been no reason to shoot and to run away had he not, been involved in this and shot him. And I don't think there was any other shooter. I think Oswald was the only shooter. That does not necessarily mean that Oswald acted alone, as in it was just like the work of one crazy man. Oswald was someone who had lived in the Soviet Union. So already, I'm going to say red flags. That's, double meaning there, right? But Oswald just is a suspicious character. I'm pretty sure Oswald was a communist and probably had some sort of allegiance and maybe connection with the Soviet Union. We don't really know for sure. And one of the big reasons that we don't know a lot for sure about the Kennedy assassination is that when Oswald is arrested and Oswald is being transferred from I don't know what it's like. This is all happening in Dallas. When Oswald is being transferred, he from one jail to another, and this is on the news, and there's police all around. This is super, super public. Everybody cares about what happens to Oswald, right? I mean, the entire country is tuned in and wants to see what's going on. And as they're transferring him, a guy by the name of Jack Ruby comes up and shoots him and kills him. in broad daylight, and I mean with police everywhere. Um, and Jack Ruby was the owner of a local Dallas strip club. He was just kind of this seedy dude that his whole reason was that he was upset that Oswald killed Kennedy and he liked Kennedy. But it's just very strange that it seems like Oswald is kind of silenced, I mean, literally he's killed. And maybe it's as simple as that. But the lack of answers because he was killed, the lack of answers about why he did it, is really why there's so much conspiracy surrounding the JFK assassination. And there's just a lot, people don't necessarily believe the official story. And it really begins this time, whether or not the official story is true or not, it begins this time where people begin to doubt what their government's telling them more and more. And that's kind of the big, one of the big ideas behind, or things to take away, I guess, from the Kennedy assassination. Hey, oh, here's a picture. This Oswald being shot by Ruby. So the guy with the gun there is Ruby, and then he's shooting Oswald. Oswald's the dude that looks like Bruce Willis. And that's a joke. Someone superimposed instruments in there, which is kind of funny. There you go. I hope you enjoy that. Okay. I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly. You guys need to know Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson is interestingly, president who was not elected, at least just, he took over. He does get elected in 1964. Certainly not the dynamic, energetic character that Kennedy is, but really is able to get a ton done. And a lot of it is because of the legacy of Kennedy. He can come in and say, Kennedy would have wanted this, and people were very sympathetic to that kind of thing. And so he does do that. He does, basically exactly does that with the Civil Rights Act and says, let's finish what Kennedy started. But Johnson proposes what is called the Great Society. And I want you to know the Great Society. The Great Society is one of the biggest kind of social changes as far as political changes really since the New Deal. And in American history, you have the New Deal and then you have the Great Society. And both of these are the government doing a lot for people. They're both, you could say, in general, liberal democratic policies that change the country greatly. Okay. So, and it is a lot of ways an extension of the New Deal. We're going to look at some specifics of it. We're just going to mention civil rights and not talk about it a whole lot right now. But the Great Society includes, let's make it a great society for African Americans, pass the Civil Rights Act, pass the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination in the polls based on race. So the Great Society includes that. The Great Society also includes a war on poverty. It includes creating the Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is really the beginning of the welfare system that we kind of know more, where the government is creating houses and building housing for people. The government is doing things like giving welfare in the war on poverty. I'm going to move on, and I hope you guys are taking notes and following along with this. But the government is creating programs like Medicare for, to care for the elderly. That's going to be like a quiz question. Medicare to care for the elderly, and it's money. When my parents currently have, their medical insurance basically is under Medicare. It doesn't pay enough, so they have to get supplemental stuff, but that's what Medicare is for. Medicaid to pay medical needs for people who can't afford it, so those that are poor. So this is the federal government basically providing health care to, not universally, but to those segments of society that wouldn't be able to get it themselves. These systems are not perfect, but they, are huge, and they do cost a lot of money. And this is part of the Great Society, right? You tax people and create these programs to help those who can't help themselves. And Johnson views that this is government's role in society. Creating institutions like the National Endowment for the Arts, public funding for arts, National Public Radio and Public Television. We still have these things. So this is government money that's being used for to improve society, right? The whole idea of a great society. We're going to have equal rights for African Americans. We're going to take care of the poor. We're going to take care of the elderly. We're going to just create a better society through arts and radio and television and these kind of things that aren't just market driven, right? Like you watch National Public Tele or PBS, and it's not market driven. You have like Mr. Rogers on there, which is very slow, and Bob Ross. They're not really on there to sell products, but because they're seen as having value beyond just what they're able to pull in as far as viewers and all the rest. Allow me to take a sip. So I just want you to see before we move on, Kennedy had a lot of ideas, but it's really Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, that is the president that, although he's less famous than Kennedy, he's a president that gets so much of this done. And really, I don't think there's ever been a Democrat president since then that has been able to create as many programs and change the face of the government and its relationship to the people like Johnson has done. I think, Roosevelt did it, FDR before him, but Johnson has done it. He certainly did it, I think, maybe not just as much as Roosevelt, but nearly. There's a picture of our good friend LBJ. By the way, apparently this is slightly inappropriate, but apparently LBJ liked to meet and have meetings while he was on the toilet, and so he would like make people stand outside the door while he was using the restroom, and he would like tell them things and tell them to do things. So there was like no place, I guess, that was off limits for Johnson. Anyway, his career was overshadowed by two central issues of the 1960s: civil rights, which he really does advocate. And a lot of people have said the reason he did it is because he wanted, to court voters and, black voters. And, maybe that's true. But the fact is he did pass civil rights legislation and really promote that and get Congress to do it. But also Vietnam. Johnson is the president. And this is the reason he's such a controversial figure, because conservatives don't like him because of all the Great Society programs. And liberals don't like him because he is the president more than any other that gets us into Vietnam and gets us in deep into Vietnam. And so we'll talk about that more later. But Johnson's legacy is really wrapped up into Vietnam. And if you kind of point back to, I would think, who's to blame for our policies in Vietnam, I would say President Johnson more than anybody else. If you need to assign blame for what happened. Okay, this is kind of the last part of the politics. I would know, and even the textbook, says this. The Supreme Court of the 1960s and 70s is a very liberal one, and so they are changing society in a lot of ways through not just laws passed, but also the way laws are interpreted, which is what the Supreme Court does, the way they're applied and interpreted. I want you to know some terms. I want you to know Earl Warren. He's the Supreme Court justice through a lot of the 60s. He's also the guy who leads the commission to investigate the Kennedy assassination. So I would know him for both of those things. Earl Warren. The Warren Report is the official stance on the Kennedy assassination, but also he is the Supreme Court justice, and it's really known as the Warren Court during his time. 1962, and I don't have the case up there, and it's Engel versus Vitale, I think it is. But prayer in public school is considered unconstitutional, a violation of the First Amendment. And kind of the big picture with all of these things is that the Supreme Court really does begin to apply more and more the freedoms of the Bill of Rights as belonging to the individual rather than being a restriction on the federal government. So when it says Congress shall make no law restricting the establishing religion, they see that as, okay, well, we don't need to have an established religion and we don't need to violate people's individual freedoms on that, rather than this being a restriction on Congress's ability to make the law that would establish a religion. And so you kind of see this pendulum swing in interpretation where it becomes more and more about individual liberties. And that's really the theme that kind of ties all this in together. It's all about individual liberties. So if, one person in your school says, I'm an atheist and I don't believe in prayer, and that violates my rights, eventually that argument's what wins the day. It's that individual, not, what the society as a whole says, and it's not trying to restrict the federal government's role at all. You guys probably are familiar with Miranda versus Arizona, even though you've never heard of the term, but this is where we get the term Miranda rights. And the Miranda rights are rights that are read to you when you're arrested. So in every, law and order and all that kind of stuff, you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney. All those things are really kind of a reinterpretation, a summary of several provisions in the Bill of Rights, like the Fifth Amendment, right to remain silent, right? They're applied specifically to the individual. Someone who is accused of a crime needs to be read his rights. And Miranda versus Arizona establishes that they have to be read their rights. You can't just accuse someone and arrest someone and not tell them their rights. And it's applying those rights in the Bill of Rights and saying that law enforcement they have an obligation to advise people of their rights. And so, right, it's putting individual rights and preferences of the individual over authority or over tradition, whatever else, the way things have been done. There's these massive changes. The Warren Court upheld civil rights legislation. And civil rights legislation, I want you to kind of note this, was challenged on the 10th Amendment. People said, you can't tell us segregation is illegal because the 10th Amendment gives states the rights to, the 10th Amendment is all a states' right amendment. And so one of the big issues with civil rights we'll get into is if the federal government pushes civil rights, it really does have to do so at the expense of the states having more and more power, right? And so the more power given to the federal government to do things like abolish segregation, that means that states don't have that power anymore, because of course the southern states were using it to uphold segregation. The Warren Court basically makes the 10th Amendment obsolete. The 10th Amendment, even though it's part of the Bill of Rights, is totally ignored because states really don't have very many rights. And by the way, this is still a big issue. I mean, this week in the news, Trump has been kind of in conflict with governors because the governor said that, they have the right to open up their states, and Trump's saying, no, he does. And in this case, a quote unquote conservative in Trump is basically trying to take away the rights of the states, which gets all into politics and whatever else. But needless to say, these issues of states' rights and all the rest are still a thing. But in this case, states' rights are minimized, and the ability of the federal government to give individual rights and to step in and protect people's individual rights is what becomes important. But we'll talk about civil rights legislation more. Lastly, monumental Supreme Court case in the early 70s. Different Supreme Court justice, I think his name was Warren Burger, but was Roe versus Wade. And you guys, are probably familiar with Roe versus Wade. You know, it has to do with abortion. I'm not going to get into a lot of details on this. We're really running out of time. This has been too long. But I just want you to see the thinking here. The thinking is the right of the mother as an individual kind of supersedes all other considerations. It, in this case, supersedes the life of the child. It supersedes what society had long said. It superseded what the churches around the country had long said. It becomes all about an individual right rather than what had been the consensus beforehand. And you can see there's that push in that direction. It's all about individual freedoms and rights and the like. Of course, you could argue against Roe versus Wade based on individual freedoms and rights because you could do it based on the rights of the unborn, which is a good argument that really no one has an answer to. If you accept this as a human life, it should be preserved, and most everyone at this point agrees that it's a human life. They just don't value it. So anyway, I would know Roe versus Wade as well, but the big picture is to kind of see the connection between all these. It's all about individual rights. I think this is it for us. Yeah, that's it for us today. I'm sorry that this probably went longer than I was hoping and that you were hoping. But that's kind of an overview of the political issues of the 1960s. And then we're going to get into civil rights and other social issues and the war in Vietnam later on. Okay, let me figure out how to turn all this off. Here we go. Let's stop recording.